Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this Wellbeing Blueprint event. It's not a luxury, pets and social justice. So excited to have you here today. I am Natalie Williams, Director of the Wellbeing Blueprint at the Full Frame Initiative. FFI serves as the backbone organization for the Wellbeing Blueprint. Full Frame Initiative is a national social change organization working to make this a country where everyone has a fair shot at well-being. The Blueprint is a growing community of action of public sector, community business, and nonprofit leaders, and a roadmap to drive structural change that will move us forward towards equity, well-being, and justice, and honestly bring us closer to our North Star, a country where everyone has a fair shot at well-being. Why is this important? Because we don't all have a fair shot, because racism, sexism, homophobia, and additional otherings are baked into our systems and into our country, creating fast tracks to well-being for some and dramatically reducing that access for others. The Wellbeing Blueprint work and community focuses on fixing systems, not people. We highlight what matters to people and not what's the matter with people. We are all hardwired for well-being. It's a drive and not a destination. Well-being is something that we do not have, that we do not do or have. It's how each of us live our lives. We are individually and collectively healthier, more resilient, more productive when we feel that we belong, that we can count on others and that they can count on us, that what matters and that we matter and we have purpose and that we're safe and that things are somewhat predictable and that our material needs can be met without shame or danger. This is our biological drive for well-being. We've been talking as a team how pets help us meet our drive for well-being, and honestly, we're just super excited to be digging into this topic today. Before we dive into our session today, I would like to take a moment for a land acknowledgement, to formally recognize the historical and continuing connection between Indigenous people and their native lands. I acknowledge that North Houston, where I live and work, is the traditional territory of the Sano-Wakayos people. I acknowledge that this legacy, as well as the ongoing struggle faced by the Indigenous communities around Houston, Texas, and the country for recognition and land ownership. We all have a responsibility to consider this legacy of colonialism in our history as a nation. I recognize the privileges we enjoy today because of colonialism and strive to understand and break down the systems that perpetuate these harmful patterns while building and supporting systems that are just. I hope you also take the time to acknowledge the native lands that you sit on, wherever you are joining us for today. I'm thrilled to be joined by Amanda Arrington, the Senior Director of the groundbreaking Pets for Life program at the Humane Society of the United States. Amanda guides a social justice-driven approach to create equity and access to pet resources and information for people in underserved communities. I'm also thrilled to be joined by Diane Prado, who is the founder of the executive director of the Housing Equity and Advocacy Resource Team, HEART L.A, a legal nonprofit that helps ensure people and their pets remain housed. These two leaders are implementing innovations in pet advocacy, housing justice, and equity for a conversation about transformative change and the connections between pets, well-being, equity, and justice. We not only want to hear from our speakers today, but from you as well. There will be some dedicated time after our Q&A with our speakers for you to weigh in and ask your particular questions. But please feel free to share your questions throughout the session using the Q&A function that will help us track them better, and use that chat function for any comments you want to share. You may also check in via the chat with your name and location that you live in or work in. So let's jump in. I'm super excited to have you all here today. Amanda, I met you and was just inspired by the work that you're doing. And honestly, having been an activist, I think pretty much my whole life, I was shocked at the depth of how pets can, and the issue with pets and access to housing. It's a world that I never realized existed. And the level of knowledge that you provided throughout that time inspired me to dig deeper and to have deeper understanding about how this impacts people throughout the country. And then introducing us to Diane, who is boots on the ground, who is advocating, who's connecting resources, and who's working in the community as a leader around the work that you're doing to ensure equal access to housing for people who have pets and who need their pet companionship. So just super excited to have you all here today. And I want to start with our first question, which is, tell us about each of your organizations and what you do and why they're needed. Starting with you, Amanda.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for having me here today. And I was equally inspired, Natalie, talking to you and hearing about the work at Wellbeing Blueprint. It's so exciting for us in the sort of animal advocate space to do this intersectional work and to have conversations and broaden the stakeholders around issues of pet keeping and the inequity that unfortunately exists in that. So thank you for having this event and for inviting me. So the Pets for Life program, like you said, it is a program of the Humane Society of the United States. And we created the program almost 12 years ago to increase equity and access to pet resources, specifically for people experiencing poverty with their pets or living in underserved areas with their pets. There's an estimated about 20 million pets that live in poverty with their families who desperately love their pets and want and need access to services for those pets. And so in addition to providing direct care services like spay neuter, vaccinations, veterinary care, behavior support supplies, sort of on a more kind of global scale, PFL is focused on creating a philosophical shift in the animal welfare movement. So we're looking at larger issues of racial and economic injustice, how that impacts people and their pets, but also how animal welfare as a field has either been complicit in or even directly contributed to systems of oppression and discrimination through our work. And then how do we begin to disrupt and dismantle those systems, specifically within animal welfare, but to use sort of this love for animals that so many people have to address those systems of inequity in society at large. And I think also, as you had said, the program has been implemented now in over 50 communities across the country.
Oh, sorry. Diane, can you tell us a little bit
Sure.
about your organization and why it's needed?
Yeah, no problem. So HEART L.A. was created. I am a housing rights attorney, have been a housing rights attorney for about 12 years and was doing specifically eviction defense, so representing tenants that were facing eviction and displacement. And so I brought my love for, I also brought my love for animal welfare and housing welfare together to be able to help provide representation to tenants, free legal representation to tenants with pets that were facing eviction, and then also provide trainings to animal welfare organizations, legal organizations, animal services about know your rights, about tenants with pets and what tenants with pets need to know in regards to what their housing rights are. There's a lot of myths and misconceptions that tenants have whenever they receive a notice or a verbal threat from a landlord. And so there's a lot of education and outreach that's needed in order to get the information out there to be able to have tenants with pets be protected and know that they don't have to, be separated from their pets or leave their homes. And so it was, we're located in Los Angeles. And so it was really bridging the housing rights world and the animal welfare world to be able to get the resources and the education out there for tenants that have pets.
And so that really leads us into my next question. While many of our attendees may be familiar with housing inequity or with the issue around resourcing pets and the difficulty doing that, can you help us understand how inequities, and talk a little bit about how inequities are impacting the housing crisis as it relates to pet ownership, pet companionship. And how does this point on affordable housing and insecurity? What's that connection between those main issues or barriers for people?
Diana, I think that's a good one for you to start, if you don't mind.
Yeah, not at all. So I'll start with LA specifically. So in LA in about 2019, there was about 45,000 evictions filed in LA County a year, which ends up being about 5 families being displaced per hour or being evicted per hour in LA County. Those numbers reduced due to the pandemic, and there was emergency protections that were in place during the pandemic. And then sadly, those numbers have now, with those emergency protections coming to an end, and with the, while the pandemic is still here, but, now opening up and those protections ending, those numbers have skyrocketed. And we're back to pre-pandemic numbers, and not just back to pre-pandemic numbers, higher. So in June 2019, there was about 3,400 evictions. And now in June 2022, it's about 4,000 evictions that have been filed in LA County. And so when we talk about housing inequities, what we're facing, and on top of that, rents have skyrocketed across the nation about 25%, if not more. And what we find is renters are paying more than 40 to 50% of their income going towards rent. So imagine that, right? You get your salary and then you get your rent check. You get your employment check, and 50% of that is going towards rent. That's not even talking about food. That's not talking about taking care of, your family. And so, and your pet, right? And so people are truly having to choose whether to have a roof over their head or their pet, where housing is a human right. We can't ask people to participate and live their lives and to be, compassionate, and participate in lives if we're also not being able to provide safe and secure housing for them. And so the inequities are very unbalanced. 90% of landlords are represented by attorneys if they're being evicted. Meanwhile, 90% of tenants are not receiving any type of representation by attorneys. So the power imbalance is very off. And then I'll jump into Amanda, who's going to talk. Amanda's like, what am I going to talk about? No, about the inequities that are particularly affecting people of color, right? Property rights is inherently rooted in racist principles. It was created here. This wasn't our land. So thank you for doing the land acknowledgement. In LA County, we are located on Tongva land. And so it's really understanding the fact that these property rights, is rooted in racism. And so that hurts, right? That makes people kind of like cringe. And so it's really digging into that cringe. It's really digging into that and feeling like, ooh, why are we cringing? Why does that rub the wrong way? As it should. And understanding that the folks that are most particularly affected are people of color. We have practices of redlining from the beginning of when we have taken away property from Indigenous folks and didn't recognize the fact that their right to the land. So I'll toss it over to Amanda.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that, if that's okay now, Natalie, about what Diana mentioned, which is redlining, and why that's such an important issue for us to understand and sort of deepen the understanding of this very clear through line between policies of the past and the outcomes of the present, to where, like Diana was saying, white families own their homes at double the rate of Black and Latino families. And where Black and Latino households that are renting are 2 times more likely to be evicted than their white counterparts. And so how did we end up in this place where there are such disparities, where there's such a significant difference in experience along race and ethnicity lines? And so there are a lot of reasons for that. There are a lot of policies past and present, but redlining is one that is extremely significant. And in my opinion, there's not enough being done to sort of acknowledge the cause and effect. And unless we do that, we can't adequately repair the harm that was caused. So economists estimate, just to sort of get a little granular here for a second, if everyone will stay with me on it, but economists estimate that about 80% of a person's lifetime wealth accumulation depends on where that person starts, and then the intergenerational wealth transfers that a person receives during their life. So advantage is literally passed down generation to generation. And one of the top ways, if not the top way, that a person can build wealth in the United States is through home ownership. So you might all be kind of familiar with the details of redlining, but I don't think it ever hurts to kind of refocus on something so important. And so if we're looking at the sort of intergenerational transfer, and so we sort of take a look back at generations before us, in the 30s or late 20s and into the 30s, the U.S. put together in response to the Great Depression to try to pull the country out of the Great Depression, what is still to date the largest welfare program in our country's history, called the New Deal. And if you're like me, you sort of learned about it in high school, but maybe never fully got the facts or sort of the truth of what the New Deal was. And a big chunk of it, the biggest chunk of what the New Deal did, was it provided the opportunity for home ownership for people. So there were these government-backed mortgages that were part of the New Deal. Before this, home ownership was a lot harder because someone had to put down like 50% of the home price to purchase it. And then the remaining money, they could only have a loan for like 5 to 10 years. So there's just weren't as many people who had the ability to do that. With these government-backed mortgages through the New Deal, for the first time, what it offered was little to no down on a home, and you could have your loan for up to 30 years. So it just made this possible for tens of millions of more people in the US. Unfortunately, 98% of the people who received this government support were white people. And so the way that these mortgages were provided and sort of approved and carried out was through this national appraisal system that was created. So this appraisal system was adopted in cities and towns across the country, and that guided where these government-backed funds would and would not be given. And so the areas that were deemed hazardous or declining, so they did not receive support, those were predominantly communities of color. And then the areas that were chosen to receive the support, those were mostly white communities. And so that was a way that current generations received those intergenerational wealth transfers from the generations before. So this government sanctioned policy of the 1930s, it's not just something of the past. It is what has set up the racial and economic segregation that we see today. And it still determines so many outcomes, including around housing opportunity and building wealth. And for us, it also has a very clear connection to the availability and accessibility of pet resources. So there was a study that was done in 2018 from the National Reinvestment Community Coalition that looked at all these communities redlined in 1937 and 1938. And what it showed is that today, over 3/4 of the communities that were redlined are still the most economically devastated communities today, and still predominantly people of color live in those areas. And conversely, the areas that receive this government support, 90% of those are still the middle to upper class communities today, and mostly white.
Well, that's so fascinating about the connections and how the foundation of our system never was set up for communities of color to thrive economically. I want to pivot a little bit to a question that sparked when we first met, Amanda, and this was a curiosity that I had, which is how has pet advocacy over time through the Humane Society and other organizations, how has that advanced in communities of color, specifically Black and Latino communities? And what does that look like moving forward? And love for Diane to also weigh in on that question.
So there's sort of a couple of layers to this question. So one, just as far as like the official movement or sort of the formal participation in animal protection or in animal welfare is still predominantly white women. There are a couple of different studies and sort of research that's been done around this, and most of them are sort of similar in that it shows that between 70 and 80% of people who are working in the space or who are official volunteers in the space are white. So we have a significant lack of inclusion and diversity within animal welfare. And that is an issue that we have to be very deliberate and active in starting to resolve. And so that leads into so many other things around representation, around sort of true inclusion and understanding the varied lived experiences of people. So we have a lot of work to do in that area around sort of who has the opportunity to participate and sort of being an animal advocate. And sort of same goes with, who is donating, who's engaged, all of those layers. But sort of on the other end, as far as pet keeping, there are major inequities and disparities there as well. And that's an issue that Pets for Life is a program and that HEART L.A. is a program is working on, is to really elevate the fact that the love for pets and the joy and comfort and companionship that people receive from having pets should not be available only to people of a certain income or only for people who live in a certain neighborhood. We believe very strongly in Pets for Life that human animal bond and all of the benefits that come from it, that transcends all boundaries, whether that's geographic or socioeconomic or race and ethnicity, it doesn't matter. And so we want to create a world and create a system where everybody has equal opportunity to have a pet if they so choose, and to receive all of that unconditional love that a pet can bring to your life.
Thank you for that. Diane, did you want to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, I think that, okay, I kind of forgot the question, but I know where we're going. And I think the important thing also is that because housing has been made as like a commodification, the commodification of housing, right? Along with pets. So housing isn't a right, it's now a privilege. Housing is created for profit. So it's choosing profit over people. And so in creating a business model out of housing folks, the same thing happened with pets. Pets didn't become something that was like, oh, wow, everyone should be deserving of a pet. Everyone should be able, of course, we know the human animal bond. It became a privilege. And so in the world of animal welfare and in the housing world, both those things that all should be deserving of became profit, right? And so what that did is that it created a imbalance, particularly of people of color, right? And so it's now bringing both of those worlds and raising back the point that, look, everyone is deserving of housing. Everyone is deserving of a pet. It doesn't matter if there's someone that's unhoused, right? As we know that many animals of unhoused folks actually live far better lives than those of animals that are stuck in like a home for 12 hours without seeing their owner who's gone for work all day, right? Or just like staring out the window, like being like, can I go outside? So it's changing those dynamics. Thankfully, like within the past 10 years, homelessness and caring about housing has become sexier. So there's been funding for that, which has then, like it's now we're like, oh my gosh, what? There's homelessness that exists. We're like, yeah, it's existed for quite some time. So with that also has come the fact that in order to be able to help the pet, you have to help the pet owner, right? By default, the definition of a pet is that it requires an owner, or also just be a stray animal, right? We domesticated these pets to be our pets. And so it's been wonderful in the animal welfare worlds that now there's been more recognition of not judging the person and instead recognizing we need to help the person to help the pet. And so that has been slowly bridging together and breaking down biases that folks had before, that people had before about who is deserving of a pet, what do we need to do? And so it's really breaking down those misconceptions that, that pet ownership is a privilege and that housing ownership is a privilege. And really both of those are a right? Everyone is deserving to be able to have safe and secure home. Everyone is deserving to be able to have a pet that's going to be able to improve their life. And so it's bridging those two together.
So I love this big picture, giving us the background to this issue and what people are facing. Just looking here for a little bit of some specifics on like specific things that are impacting people. My question for you is, how does this housing crisis that we all know is going on in this country affect pet companionship? And how does, on the other end, having a pet often create additional layers of barriers to stable and secure housing? So what are you seeing in your community in this area?
Diana, you want me to start sort of with a national scope?
Sure. Yeah.
So nationally, what we are seeing in just about every community and that every shelter is reporting is that one of the top 2 reasons that people are surrendering their pets to the shelter is because of housing insecurity. And I think that is even undercounted because not every shelter is asking the really nuanced question. So someone might present to the shelter and say, I need to surrender my pet because it doesn't get along with this cat. But they might be in a home that they've been forced to move into with a family member who has a cat. And so really it's at its core, it's a housing issue. But even with that, it is still one of the top 2 reasons, the other being inability to afford veterinary care. So the top 2 reasons that people are having to give up their pet and why families are being torn apart is due to finances, whether that is around housing or it's around a medical bill and veterinary cost. So like Diana said, I think that just in the last few years, animal advocates are beginning to understand that what they're seeing, who's presenting to their shelter in these moments of crisis, it's not an individual problem. And Natalie, you said it at the beginning around sort of the goals and the philosophy of the Wellbeing Blueprint is that we have a systems problem. And for a long time in animal welfare, we blamed the individual for whatever struggle or challenge they were facing. There was a lot of judgment, a lot of placing blame. And I think we still have a lot of work to do, but I think we're finally coming around to a place of seeing that people are just on the receiving end of an unfair and unjust system. And so when people are showing up and saying, I don't have anywhere to live, can you please take my dog? That we can start to not only treat people more kindly and sort of compassionately in those moments where there's trauma, but we can start to build programs and responses and solutions that can keep people and pets together.
Thank you. Diana?
Yeah, one of the numerous ways that the housing crisis, specifically in LA, is affecting pet companionship is in LA, we have rent control, which is great. There should be rent control protections throughout the nation in every city. And so when new landlords come in, they use pets as a vehicle to threaten eviction, stating because they want to raise the rents because of rent control. And so that is one of, and particularly with even the emergency protections that have been in place and tenants having protections from having to pay rent during this pandemic period, landlords were using pets as an easy vehicle because they couldn't evict a tenant for non-payment of rent. So they wanted to evict a tenant in any other way that they could. Long-term tenants that have been in places for about 20 years that have had pets their whole time, but let's say they signed a lease 20 years ago that didn't include a pet, or they signed a lease that was in English and they're monolingual Spanish speakers and that didn't include a lease. Landlords use that as a vehicle to be able to evict tenants. And then in terms of the additional layers, barriers for tenants with pets, look, while California may be one of the states that has stronger tenant protections, California is actually one of the least pet inclusive housing, has the less pet inclusive housing. And just as a reference, there's an amazing organization. My Pitbull is my family. Pitbull is my family. Yeah.
My Pitbull is my home, I think.
My Pitbull is my home. Yes, my Pitbull. Also my family. My Pitbull is my home. That has a rental registry that is you're able to put in your zip code and see if there's any pet inclusive housing in your area. If there's pet deposits required, if there's any, breed restrictions, any size restrictions. And when you put in the zip code of where my offices are located in Los Angeles, what had come out is that there's about, in the 50-mile radius, 13 available properties. And of those 13 available properties, I believe that only 2 of them didn't even have any pet fees. And so in terms of the barriers of finding housing, it is so hard for folks to even find housing that allows pets, let alone allows pets and doesn't charge an extra either pet rent or a pet deposit, which I always laugh about the fact that I was like, my dog that passed earlier this year, I was like, he didn't work to pay rent. Like, how is he paying rent? And so those are just additional barriers that people have to face that have pets. And then I get all the questions all the time, like, do I tell them I have a pet? Do I not? It's my support animal. What do I do? And so what do folks do when they're trying to find housing, right? Or they're being faced with eviction and they want to try to, they're scared, right? So they don't want to be evicted from their home, but they don't also want to go through the court experience. But then how are they going to find housing? I mean, it's real. And so when we are now advocating for landlords to increase their profit and become more pet inclusive because they can charge pet rent or they can charge a pet deposit, what that actually is doing is disproportionately affecting people of color and low-income folks that can't afford a pet rent and can't afford a additional pet deposit, right? Only for just having someone that's part of their family that they need. I mean, folks need their pets. It improves their lives. So it's a huge barrier that people with pets have when even looking for housing.
Natalie, may I share just a little bit more about what Diana is saying around sort of that term pet inclusive?
Yes.
So the most frequently used term that you'll see in housing is pet friendly. And so all of us who are sort of working in the space are trying to change that to pet inclusive and what that really means, because there will be an apartment complex or a landlord that will use the term pet friendly because they have a dog park on the premises, or because just pets aren't immediately disallowed. And so they'll have this label of pet friendly, and yet they'll say that, you can't have a dog that's over 20 pounds, or you can't have these 10 breeds of dogs, or you can't have more than 1 cat and 1 dog. That's really not pet friendly. It's definitely not pet inclusive. And so what we're working on, what Diana's working on, and other national groups and local organizations are starting to work towards is sort of defining what pet inclusive means, which isn't just about saying you can have a pet here. It's where there are not the restrictions around breed and around size and weight, and where the financial component doesn't make it unavailable to people. A lot of places will charge a pet deposit on top of a security deposit. And so it's double the cost to move into a place, or they will charge a monthly rent that just makes it absolutely impossible for people to have their pets. So there's a lot that sort of goes into what pet inclusive truly means, and it has to be affordable, available, and accessible for everybody.
I'm going to write that down. Affordable, available, and accessible. So thank you for that depth of information and for the specifics that are really true barriers to people being able to have their pets and be housed. What has changed or shifted since you started doing this work? So both of you have a depth of passion and experience in this work. What have you seen that has changed or shifted? And what has remained constant? And I'll start with you, Diana.
Yeah. What has changed is what I was stating before is the recognition that to help the pet, you need to help the person, and the judgment on the person, right? There has been, a lot of laws in place that criminalize the ownership of a pet, right? Tethering laws, right? That make a lot of laws that just don't make any sense, that instead, criminalize the person and don't help. And so what has shifted is that perspective of not even the word like a responsible pet owner. what does that mean, right? Like, so does a responsible pet owner require, 4 walls around them? That has shifted, in the sense that, I always find it very funny how, you can't, someone that's unhoused, you can see how they're treating their pet right there in front of them, right? Like you can see, oh, wow, they're walking them, they're loving them, they're whatnot. And yet the judgment that a person that's unhoused faces, because they don't have walls around them. You can see exactly what they're doing. But that person that has a home, they could be treating their animal horribly. But they don't have those eyes right on them. That's shifted. That's taken a huge shift that I've seen, at least. I mean, not completely, not completely. There's still folks that believe otherwise, but that's been exciting. So I think that has been one of the biggest shifts that occurred, that in order to help the pet, you need to help the person, and to stop judging the person and to provide services to that person, whatever they may need. And it's not just for their pet. Does this person need, Medicaid? How do we get this person connected to human resources in order to be able to help that person and their health, so that they can stay healthy in order to be able to help their pet? And recognizing the need for human services for that human in order to be able to also help the pet has been a huge shift in animal welfare that has been exciting. And then particularly with housing, recognizing that a housing crisis is a housing crisis for the pet. If the pet can't remain housed, then that means that they end up in a shelter. And so how do we reduce both of them? And even just going from the model of, oh, okay, well, if this person's being evicted, well, let's just get them a foster, stopping that, like being like, oh, wait, how can we keep this person and their pet together? We don't need to go to the drastic measure of then separating these people, the person and the pet. How do we keep them together? And then slowly but surely, that has been changing, right? And which is exciting.
That is exciting. Amanda?
I think Dana covered it. Like, that really is the biggest shift that we are seeing, that we are still in the middle of. I wouldn't say it is a change that has occurred. It is a change that is in the process of occurring. It's just for animal advocates to believe, to sort of embody that, to be a true advocate for animals, you have to be an advocate for people, and you have to be a housing advocate as well. So I think that is, starting to really take shape. Again, still a lot of work to do. But on sort of the flip side of what hasn't changed, is that, housing insecurity is a layered and complicated issue, which is why I think it's hard for a lot of people to engage, because it's difficult and it's very complicated and complex. But more generally, that there's an absolutely insufficient response to housing insecurity, which has only sort of been exacerbated the last few years by the pandemic. Right now, only 1 in 4 households that need some type of housing assistance actually receive some type of housing assistance. So there's just really simply a lack of funding and a lack of desire, sort of at all levels of government, federal government, state legislators, local government, to view housing as a basic human right. That has not changed in a way that I know Diane and I both would like to see.
Yes. And it's so important to understand that this is something that other people benefit from. So there's some people that this inequity is concentrated in their community for generations. And then there's some people that are benefiting from others being in this housing crisis and not being housed. And those are the structures we really have to look at. So in thinking about opportunities, what specific opportunities do you see for system change to promote access to housing and pet companionship? And I will start with Amanda.
Opportunities for how people can become involved and engaged on the issue, do you think? Okay.
Yeah, and also if you can pepper that a little bit with the you've been talking a lot about system change. Maybe start with that idea of, or we'd like to know, since we talk about these are systemic issues, what are some systemic issues or systemic change that you would like to see that can change this dynamic and promote access to housing and pet companionship?
Well, I don't want to oversimplify the answer, and it's
Right.
not really a simple answer, but there is one way that there could be a lot of change happen and to happen in a major way, and that's around policy, which I sort of hate that that's the answer because it can be difficult, it can take a lot of time, and it can be frustrating. But when we talk about like the history of redlining, that was a government policy that we have never fully addressed. And we definitely have not repaired the harm that was caused by that policy. And that's just one. Like there are still ongoing policy decisions being made every single day at all levels of government that contribute to discriminatory practices and inequitable outcomes. And so like we have to change the policy that is happening through the people that we vote for, through holding elected officials accountable. And again, that sort of happens at all levels, you know, so like at a federal level, the government chooses what programs to fund, and it chooses who receives tax incentives, banking and lending institutions, how they're regulated. Like there's still so much information that is sort of in the present that shows how people of color who are applying for home loans are treated differently than white people. Like there are still just so many things that are going to have to at some point be addressed in some sort of legal way in order for us to, again, not only address what's happened up to this point, but to change it moving forward. And then sort of in your state legislature, same thing, you know, states receive federal money. And so how states choose to spend that money, where they choose to invest it, and where they choose to put state specific money, that matters. That's another major opportunity to invest in subsidized housing, to change laws, to have requirements around fair and affordable. And then that again happens on a local level. So your mayor, your city council, your board of county commissioners, they're making these decisions annually in their budget. You know, where are they choosing to put the money? Which departments of the city and county are they putting funds in? And it's pretty obvious that housing is never at the top of that list. You know, we invest in all other ways in communities. Too much for my liking, oftentimes in punishment and in the criminalization that Diana talked about, and not enough in support and sort of being resource focused. So I think at all of those levels, there's just insufficient action that's being taken and investment that's being made to ensure that housing is a human right. So I think that's one major way that all of us can have input and can hopefully start to set expectations. And I will say in sort of that policy realm, there's one area that we don't always hear about. You know, we'll hear about sort of rent increases and how rent is becoming more and more expensive in a higher percentage of people's income, and that's a hardship, and it is. But the other part of the equation is wages. That until we have a living wage, until that is legally mandated, that we have a living wage for everyone, the housing insecurity issue will never fully be addressed.
Love that connection. Super powerful and looking at that, because you're right, that gets missed a lot in this conversation. Diana, what are some opportunities do you see for system change to promote access to housing and pet companionship?
Yeah, I think huge, particularly for the animal welfare community, is just educating oneself about what is the eviction process in each state, right? What are the rights of tenants in general? And then those rights of tenants are the rights of tenants with pets. And one of the biggest things is, you know, in every single state in the United States, there is a legal process for an eviction. And many folks don't realize that. So they either get threatened by a landlord, either verbally threatened, and then they think that they need to leave. And I think as animal welfare advocates, it's really great to be able to, you know, get trained on, oh, what are the legal rights? What does an eviction process look like? So that when they are faced with someone that is, you know, showing up at their shelter or calling their organization, they're like, oh my gosh, my landlord is threatening me. They know the questions that they could possibly ask in order to be able to prevent that eviction, in order to be able to say, like, are they verbally threatening you? Okay, well, they can't do that. Take a deep breath. You don't have to leave. Let's see how we can connect you to resources, or being able to provide talking points to that person. So I think that by educating oneself, being able to get trainings on what are the legal rights of the eviction process is really important. Not only just to be able to help tenants with pets, but also to be able to, you yourself know, as an animal welfare advocate that perhaps is a renter. So I think that's one way to be able to get involved, to be able to provide support to oneself and others. And then just piggybacking on what Amanda said, is getting involved in not just pet related issues, but housing related policy issues, right?
Mhm.
To advocate for, there's a national movement at this moment right now called the right to counsel, meaning that anybody that's facing eviction, any low income individual that's facing eviction should have a right to an attorney, kind of like the public defenders of the housing world. So just like anybody that's facing, criminal charges is assigned a public defender, anyone that's facing eviction should also be able to have a right to an attorney. If you're going to be thrown out on the streets, then you should have somebody that's advocating there for you. That's something that's happening on a national level in every state and city that animal welfare advocates can get involved in, right? Sure, it isn't an animal issue, but it is, because in order to be able to provide representation to a tenant with a pet that's facing eviction, you're keeping both of those people, the people and the person, in their home. So there are different ways: advocating for rent control, advocating for stronger tenant protections in your local area, right? Like I said, the city of LA has rent protections, and then another city outside of LA County may not. And so it's really advocating at your local level and getting involved and seeing outside of the scope of, oh, this doesn't have pet in the title of this legislation, but if it has housing, or just like Amanda was saying, if it's something in regards living wages, that all is interconnected. Health, right? Any type of policy that is advocating for access to healthcare, huge. A lot of tenants with pets are tenants with disabilities, and tenants with disabilities have fair housing rights. But if a tenant with a disability can't access healthcare, they don't even have the appropriate measures to be able to assist them and help them. All of those issues are interrelated: health, wages, housing. So when we're thinking of, hey, what policies can we advocate for? Not just look at, oh, is it pet related? It's all related. Advocating for access to health is advocating to keep people and their pets together. Advocating for higher wages is advocating for people and their pets together, right?
Mhm.
So it's that. So for me, it's educating oneself on what is the legal process is, what are the rights, and then being able to advocate on a local, state, and national level.
Mhm. Yeah. So I want to go to questions from our audience, and I thought that the chat was open. It's not. So if you have questions, please submit them to the Q&A box. It seems like the chat box is disabled, but we're getting your questions through this. So a question for you both is, can you please give more examples of how your organization uses animal welfare to address broader issues of social justice? Is there anything that stands out to you about, as you talk about this idea of the powerful example of animal welfare and how longstanding it's been in this country, and the level of energy from a lot of communities that stand behind animal welfare? Are there ways that is addressing, in the positive sense, like there's outcomes, issues of social justice?
I'll say that we view animal welfare sort of as a gateway into social justice. So again, I talked sort of about the demographics of animal welfare and sort of a pervasive position of judgment that has existed within animal welfare, and just sort of the struggle with embracing other people and really truly putting yourself in the position of other people's experiences. And so what we have tried to do in Pets for Life is to use that connectivity that comes with animals to sort of hold up this universal love for pets as a way to highlight how we're so much more alike than we are different, and to try to use that love for animals to get people to pay attention to and to care about what other people are experiencing and faced with and challenged with. So it's sort of, just this reminder that animals can bring, and this connectivity that animals can provide us with to say, okay, like if this person loves their cat, like I love my cat, maybe we have more in common than I thought. And so maybe then I would care about whatever struggle this person is faced with.
And then for heart, I mean, it really is, the reason was it was to bridge both of the worlds. And so it was kind of getting into the animal welfare world and saying like, oh, normally y'all just care about the pet. Guess what? That pet has an owner. And it's a low income person. So even however you may feel about low income folks, you need to help them. And so it was bringing light to that. And even these conversations, right? Like these conversations. So thank you for, I'm like, I even said thank you at the beginning. Thank you so much for having me and be able to say, kind of things that feel controversial, like property rights is rooted in racism, right? That's controversial. Folks don't like to hear that. People don't like to hear that. But being able to have the space to say that. I mean, I created HEART L.A. because we wholeheartedly believe that housing is a human right for the person and their pet, for everyone together. And so how we use our organization is to be able to get that message out there, to have people hear and listen to the fact that there are inequities that have been rooted at the very beginning that have caused, the disproportionate effect that we now have on people of color and people with pets in this day and time. And so it is raising awareness of that. It is providing services to people with pets that are facing displacement, to be able to have them fight back, to be able to empower them to stand up to the landlord and say, like, I don't need to leave. I have rights. And really just getting the word out there and getting people thinking of why we have housing insecurity. Why are we in this problem today? And looking past of, oh, well, it was a person's problem. They're the ones that got themselves here, and really understanding the roots of why we got here.
Yeah. So this is a direct question on looking at what services are available. And the question states, the poorest and least served communities, including communities of color in our country, are located in isolated rural areas. Almost every program to promote equity in animal welfare and social services in general is designed and piloted in urban and suburban areas. Rural areas seem to continue to be pushed to the back. How do we address this? And let's start with Amanda.
Yeah, so I think part of that statement in question we see carried out in our work, but part of it I want to kind of talk a little bit more in detail about too. So there are people who maybe live in a metro area who access is just as difficult as it is if you live in a rural area. So, we'll talk about pet resource deserts, that if you're someone who lives on the north side of Philadelphia and the closest vet is 15 minutes away, that veterinarian might as well be 5 hours away. You're not going to be able to access those services. So I agree with, and I understand sort of that how removed from services and how isolated rural communities are. But I just wanted to point out, it's not just rural communities, that we still have such a significant lack of access in suburban and urban areas as well. But specifically to the question, I think there just has to be a real thoughtfulness to the logistics of delivering services and engaging with rural communities. When we first started Pets for Life, we did develop the program in larger cities because that's where funding was available. And that's where you could sort of show a bigger return on investment for funders because there was a concentration of population. But over time, we have expanded the program, and we were very specific to do this in a thoughtful way to rural communities and to Native and Indigenous communities as well, that different types of communities have different logistical challenges, and yet the issues are very, very similar. Just the delivery of the services, might have to change a bit. But I'll tell you, like, we have communities where we operate in rural North Dakota or on Blackfeet Nation in Montana, and then also on the west side of Chicago. And we have to provide transportation to and from vet appointments almost equally the same in all of those communities. So yes, there are big differences, and we have to be very thoughtful and making sure that we're not omitting or excluding rural communities. But really the challenges are just, vast across the board in every community, unfortunately.
Diana, do you want to take that question as well?
Well, yeah, I'll just add that the same goes for legal services. I mean, legal services it's a desert in the rural communities. It truly is. And so I know, for example, in California, we have public service loan forgiveness if you enter into the nonprofit, into like legal aid communities. But in addressing that, for us, it's really been how do we get attorneys, just like how do we get vets into the rural areas, right? Like how do we get services out there? And sure, we can, provide services, but how do we then really incentivize veterinarians or attorneys or professionals to work in the rural areas where there is probably lower wages, right? So talking about wages again, talking about also, which sounds like odd to discuss, but to talk about student loan forgiveness, right? Student loan forgiveness for veterinarians, student loan forgiveness for professionals. It's a privilege to be an attorney or a veterinarian. Not everyone can afford going to veterinary school or wants to have all of those student loans at the end, right? Like I just always just forget about my student loans. I'm like, as I say it out loud on a total event, I was like, oh, what? Truly, right? It's difficult. So it's not necessarily answering that question. It's more of bringing that to light. And I guess in going to policy advocacy, how do we make it more inclusive to allow, people of color to become veterinarians, to become attorneys, and in particular out of the profession for attorneys, then not just becoming attorneys, but becoming attorneys that are then working in public interest type firms versus, an attorney that's like, well, I have $100,000 worth of student loans. I need to go to this law firm, right? How do we then work within the legal aid community to provide wages and to provide student loan forgiveness to be able to get attorneys to work in the rural areas that want to be able to provide assistance? And the same goes with veterinarians or other professionals in the animal welfare community.
And there are a lot of efforts in the policy space that would make veterinary services in particular more accessible in rural communities. So just to give a couple of examples, so what Diana was talking about and having it sort of built into statute, sort of at a state level with like a veterinary practice act, that if veterinarians will, commit to serving a rural community for 3 years, they can get a certain amount of their student loans forgiven. So that's sort of starting to be introduced and has passed in a couple of states. There are issues around the use of veterinary technicians or veterinary paraprofessionals. There's a big push that you would be able to have someone who doesn't have to have a veterinary license that could provide like rabies vaccinations, that could do some basic wellness care, and that would extend the services even further. And then an issue like telemedicine. Veterinary medicine is way behind the human health care space around telehealth services, and the human health care is really just starting to kind of have that in any sort of meaningful way. But in a lot of states, that is actually prohibited in veterinary medicine, where you cannot establish what they call a veterinary client relationship through virtual means. Someone has to be in person to do that, and that can be very limiting. So there are those policy measures that HSUS as an organization and other organizations are working towards that would hopefully start to bridge some of those gaps.
Really great. I mean, those are things that many of us would not know about at the policy level. So great education for us. So this is a question that's right on time because we're talking about funding and solutions. And the question states, our big challenge is funding, so we can expand the reach to reach deeper into our community. We have had a pet care assistance program for over 30 years, and the need has grown exponentially in the past 2 years. And our free mobile community clinics has brought us out in neighborhoods. A PFL program, Pets for Life program, would complement our program, but we worry about funding it and then answering the need for the people and the pets that we reach. So what advice would you have for that question or comment? And is there a way to think a little bit differently or more broadly about the funding issue?
So I want to acknowledge the realness of the funding challenge. Like, this is something that anybody in the nonprofit space, not even specific to animal welfare, I think it is something that you work on daily and something that you're sort of stressed out over daily. That there just never seems to be enough. And so there isn't a sort of one magic answer to that, but I do have a few thoughts of what we've utilized and sort of what we've put some effort into through Pets for Life around our messaging that has helped us in increasing the funding and allowed us to grow the program and to sustain the program for over a decade. And so part of it is changing the narrative, is really in sort of looking at how animal welfare has traditionally fundraised. It has been through this othering of like saying, we are the good people and we need your money to work against the bad people, or we need to, save these animals from the bad people. And the person who asked this question, I'm not saying that you have done this or that your organization has, sounds like you don't, but when our movement overall has defaulted to that messaging of having a villain, we've sort of built up this public perception that people are bad and that like animal cruelty is the biggest concern and issue, or that things that sort of get labeled as cruelty and neglect are really about a lack of access. So there's a lot of work that we have to do to sort of reverse and undo what has happened over the last few decades as far as this public perception of what animal welfare is. It's not fair that any one organization sort of has to go through that, but it is the reality. And so I think slowly but surely, again, just starting to change that narrative and to if we really sort of want to rely on kind of that framework of having a villain, let's make the villain the broken system. Let's make the villain poverty. Let's make the villain all of these other things that we talked about. And so staying consistent and true, holding ourselves accountable in our messaging, that a picture of a sad dog that has mange might bring in a lot of money, but what does that do to sort of the overall message that is being communicated to our donors and to the public? Where instead we could show the love that a person has for that dog and how we need to provide support and resources. So I think the way in which we tell stories is extremely important to starting to change the funding mechanisms. And to look outside of sort of traditional animal welfare funding. Only about 3% of philanthropic giving in the US is for animals. And so there's a lot of competition, but there's also just a much bigger sort of pool of funders. If we start to talk about the people that we are of service to, the communities that we are of service to, it really opens up who would be interested in the work that we do.
Awesome.
And just to piggyback off of that a little, there's I'm just plugging all different organizations. There's an organization called Community-Centric Fundraising that really is also changing the model of, I'm speaking of what Amanda's talking about, what stories we're putting out there, and also just in terms of collaborating, right? So I come from a housing world and I entered into this animal world, and so, but they're interrelated. And so to Amanda's point that there's funding available in other ways. And so thinking outside the box, is there someone in your rural community, right, or in your community that you could partner with, and instead of feeling like we're competing for money, that we're working together for this money to collaborate together because we're both making change, right? I come from a housing perspective, but I can join forces with partners that I have, that are animal welfare advocates because they're bringing spay-neuter resources and I'm bringing a legal clinic to their spay-neuter resources. We can both, apply for that grant together. We're not competing for that funding. We're working together to be able to collaborate for that funding. So I think also getting out of the mentality of like, oh, this money is limited and I'm competing against this person, and realizing that we're not competing. We're collaborating together to ensure that people and their pets remain together and housed. How do we go outside of the perspective of this money is so limited, and really just say like, look, while yes, we seem to be competing for funding, there's so much funding also out there. And if we can just think outside of the box of how we're working together to really create solutions, I think that also helps, right? It's just knowing that we're collaborating together. And how can you do that better?
So I have two more questions before we kind of move to close. But I really think these help reiterate a lot of what we've been driving towards in this conversation. This idea around perception, that privileged people care more about their pets than helping disadvantaged people. How do we address this when we talk about changing narratives? And this is just free flow, whoever wants to take it.
I think we both have lots of thoughts on this, but Diana, go ahead.
Yeah, I think also, well, kind of just going back to what Amanda was saying is client stories or just storytelling. Those people that we're helping that are defined as disadvantaged, right? I always find it, I think also just like breaking down like what is disadvantage and what is a privileged person, right? So a privileged person you just assume is like, oh, someone that has an infinite amount of money, and disadvantaged person is someone that doesn't have an infinite amount of money. And yet those that wouldn't be in a tax bracket, let's say, that would consider themselves privileged are possibly the folks that love their pets, just as much, if not more, than someone that would be in a higher tax bracket. So I think it's even how we define things, how we state things, right? Like how we're careful with our words, how we are discussing what is, who is deserving of a pet and who's not deserving of a pet. And I think it comes from like a personal, like how one speaks on it is personal to each person, right? So, and how do I address the perception? I come from a place where I was like, well, housing is a human right. I believe everyone is deserving of a pet. And so I word around it that way in my own words. And so I think it's really one, acknowledging what our own internal biases are, looking at that, and then being able to really dig into that, which isn't easy. Okay. Like that is easier said than done, right? I think that, I was just having a conversation with my friend the other day of, folks that get really offended when you're like, oh, that was pretty racist, or that sounds racist, right? People are like, oh, I'm not racist, right? If that gets told to me, I'm like, oof, okay, let me hold that. Perhaps that came from a bias of mine. And instead of being very quick and defensive, I hold that. I really do. And I figure out like, how was that? What was in me that had that come out? And digging into that in order to be able to then properly communicate what is, pet privilege, what is housing privilege. And so it really is more of like I think like we have to dig deep into how we feel about that perception and why we come with that in order to then change what it is that's coming out of our mouths.
Yeah, I think that within the animal welfare space, we're not unique in having this challenge and how we need to address in the way that Diana is saying. One of my favorite humans on the planet is Brian Stevenson, who has the Equal Justice Initiative. And I will paraphrase it a little bit, but he talks about how there is this presumption of danger and guilt in our country of people of color, and that it's just there by default. And most people don't even sort of stop and recognize that that is happening. And I think that has very much been the case within animal welfare, is that we just have this default and definition, like this very limited view of who can be categorized or defined as compassionate towards animals and loving of animals. And Diana had said it earlier, this idea of who's a responsible pet owner. So I think we've been part of sort of that bigger system, and we're just, sort of one of sort of the pillars of oppression that have held up that system. And so we have to do what Diana said, which is take a hard look at ourselves, at our own movement, and of how we are viewing the communities that we serve and where we work, and how we've set up laws and programs to sort of manage and react and respond to the communities that we serve.
Okay, so I know you all have actionable items or resources or ideas for people to connect with addressing this issue. And so our next question is, what are those actionable items to connect folks with options for their animal? Many shelters don't accept pets unless they are ESA certified, and many clients are unwilling to be without their pets. Any thoughts?
So specific on that, on like the human shelters, because I think that's what that question was sort of getting to, is like, in order to take your pet to a temporary shelter, a human shelter, the animal has to be an emotional support animal. So again, I feel like I'm such like a policy wonk on this when I'm really not. I'm more of a programs person, but I'm talking a lot about policy today. It's another area that there's a lot of effort being made. In fact, I think the bill has been introduced, but I'm not sure if it has just yet, in Congress, that would provide some subsidized support to human shelters in order to offering co-shelters with animals. Because there are a lot of shelters that would like to offer that opportunity, but they're just not set up for it. They don't have sort of, separate space if people have allergies. They don't have sort of an outdoor area for animals to go to the bathroom, or they might need a kennel, or, for liability reasons, need to provide vaccinations upon entry. Like, there are a lot of reasons why some of the human shelters aren't able to allow that. And so those organizations need support in order to become ready, and to be available to do that. And what we are hearing from those shelters is that they need some money, that they also are struggling and overwhelmed with just sort of the demand that exists. So again, to become involved in advocacy work around policy that would support those issues, I think that is something that everybody can do, specific to sort of that temporary sheltering space, if I'm understanding that question directly or correctly.
Awesome.
Yeah. And then in terms of, currently right now, HEART L.A. is, specifically focused on Los Angeles and California. We are hoping to, be able to broaden our services to at least provide information and trainings to other states and other cities. But, should people have any questions or any concerns about trying to keep a person and their pet together in regards to a housing related reason, you can feel free to email us through our website, or info@heartla.org, and be able to connect folks, to be able to keep people and their pets together and housed.
So I feel like I have been in an amazing masterclass, and I am grateful to both of you for your time and your advocacy. For me, this highlighted, it's all about changing narratives, addressing policy issues, and really spanning boundaries, looking at the deeper root cause. How can we all engage in this process to make things better? And so I really encourage our audience to reach out to Pets for Life or HEART L.A. as for resources, or just to look at the information that exists out there about the movement and how things are going. I also want to invite you all to the Wellbeing Blueprint, an opportunity for you to build your network, deepen your learning, amplify the work that you're doing, and bring about change. And so there's lots of ways to engage. Do not leave this masterclass, as I will call it, without saying, I can do something, I have a way to connect. And to do that, you can use your phone and choose our QR codes and strengthen the movement by becoming a signer. We love our signers. We tap into our community with our signers to help lift up great work, but also to advance this North Star, which is building a country where everyone has a fair shot. Connect with other leaders at our bi-weekly sessions. We have meetings twice a month where we really talk about important issues. They're very informal. It's like being around a kitchen table, but they're very expansive and innovative in the way that we do it. And it's about exploring our well-being initiatives on the map. Just like our speakers today, there's initiatives out there that are doing amazing things. Please explore those things. And last but not least, I do have a gift for all of you today because we got so excited, and I'm just trying to transition screens here, y'all, because because there's a lot going on my screen. We got so excited about this work with looking at pets and the intersectionality between pets and housing and equity that we developed a way for you to look at sharing and building conversations with your community. So we will be sending this out, but I just wanted to highlight this to all of you. Can you see my screen or no? Maybe can't. Hold on. Let's see if I can share this. I might not be able to do it until well, give me just a moment. I think I have to go back here. So I'm navigating a few screens, everybody, on this space, and it's not popping up. Give me 1 second.
Natalie, while you do that, can I give one more website?
Yes, please.
Okay. Just because it was brought up multiple times with like fundraising and messaging, we created a Pets for Life sustainability guide that digs into all of that. And worked with an amazing organization called the Community Resource Exchange. And so if you are interested in seeing that, it's sort of a 4-chapter guide talking about all the things we discussed today. If you go to humanepro.org/pets for life, you can get that guide for free download online.
Awesome. And we will send that out in notes along with the recording. We always send out recordings to guests who registered and weren't able to attend to catch them up on the discussion along with the website and information. So thank you for that. So this is something that we developed for this event today, and we hope you find it helpful. It really helps us look at the domains, the 5 domains of well-being, and surface some questions on how we can talk about pet ownership and racial equity and equity in this country and what it means, the intersectionality between all of that. So we will be sending this out to all of you as well. If you feel like striking up a conversation with your family or your community, we'd love to share that with you. Thank you all for participating in this event, but thank you so much to Amanda and Diana for your time. Really a labor of love, really appreciate this. I hope that you all learned a lot, and I'm excited to send out the information and get feedback from everybody about their experience here, as well as next steps, because we will be building out next steps for this conversation. This is not a one and done. Have a wonderful day. Appreciate you all. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.